The opening establishes an atmosphere of uncontrollable ego and public triumph. Junhae moves through the Diamond family gala feeling like a deity among mortals. The air is thick with the scent of expensive orchids and the hum of elite gossip. On his arm, Selena W. reigns is a vibrant, flashy streak of crimson, a trophy that signals Junhae is powerful enough to break the rules of high society without consequence. He revels in the cheap thrill of the room's shocked whispers, convinced that he has successfully relegated his wife, Rachel, to a forgotten shadow back at the estate. In this moment he is untouchable, fueled by top-shelf champagne, and the intoxicating high of public betrayal. The tension shifts instantly when the house lights dim and a single, piercing spotlight cuts through the ballroom. Junhae sneers toward the stage, prepared to witness the crowning of some elderly tycoon, only to have his breath stolen as the guest of honor is revealed. Standing at the microphone is Rachel C. Hayes, radiating a power and calm that makes the entire room feel small. The horror isn't found in a scandalous outburst, but in the shimmering gold of her gown and the steady, knowing gaze she levels at him from the stage. She doesn't look like a victim. She looks like his boss. This silent, regal authority creates a suffocating atmosphere that instantly strips Junhae of his composure, transforming the titan of soul into a humiliated boy caught in the glare of a truth he never saw coming. The silence that followed the announcement was not empty. It was a physical weight, pressing the oxygen out of Junhae's lungs. The applause from the surrounding tables felt like distant static, muffled by the roar of blood in his ears. In the center of the ballroom, bathed in a light so bright it seemed to turn the air into liquid gold, stood Rachel. She didn't look like the woman who sat quietly at the end of his long dining table, picking at salads while he discussed shipping manifests. She looked like a deity of commerce. Her shimmering gold gown clung to her form like molten metal, reflecting the overhead chandeliers in a way that made it impossible to look away. She held the microphone with a steady hand, her posture regal, her expression a mask of radiating power and calm that Junhae didn't recognize. Beside him, Selena's grip on his arm tightened, her manicured nails digging into the fine wool of his tuxedo. The mistress, usually so full of sharp-witted barbs and flirtatious energy, was suddenly small. The flashy red of her gown, which had felt like a bold statement of rebellion only moments ago, now looked like a desperate cry for attention against the effortless elegance on stage. Junhae, Selena whispered, her voice trembling with social embarrassment. Is that her? He couldn't answer. His jaw was frozen, his mouth slightly parted in a look of dawning horror. The titan of soul was paralyzed. Every head in the room, men who feared him, rivals who waited for him to slip, and the city's elite, slowly began to turn from the stage to him. They saw the mistress clutched to his side. They saw the guest of honor looking down at them. The irony was a blade, and it was twisting deep into Junhae's reputation. Rachel didn't look away. Her gaze was a level, indigo fire that burned through the distance between them. She didn't offer him the mercy of anger. There were no tears, no shattered glass, only a knowing confidence that suggested she had been waiting for him to arrive with his trophy, just so she could show him who truly owned the case it sat in. Thank you all for being here. Rachel's voice amplified through the speakers, rich and melodic, carrying a weight of authority that silenced the last of the murmurs. Tonight isn't just about celebrating the growth of our city's infrastructure. It's about acknowledging the hidden foundations that keep an empire standing. She paused, her eyes locking onto Junhae's with surgical precision. Sometimes those in power forget that a shadow only exists because of the light that creates it. Junhae felt the floor tilt. He had to move. To stand there was to drown in public humiliation. With a mechanical stiffness, he began the agonizing walk across the ballroom. Every step felt like he was walking through chest-deep water. The crowd parted for him, not out of respect this time, but out of a morbid curiosity to see the collision. Selena stumbled behind him, forced to follow as he dragged her toward the stage. She sensed the shift. She was no longer the woman of the hour, but the evidence of a crime. As they neared the foot of the stage, the warm golden glow of the spotlight began to spill over them, but it didn't feel like warmth. It felt like an interrogation lamp. Up close, the change in Rachel was even more devastating. Her skin glowed with a radiance that no spa could provide. It was the glow of a woman who had finally stepped into her own skin. She looked down at him from the height of the platform, her expression unbothered, as if Junh and his mistress were merely minor inconveniences at her gala. "Rachel," he managed to breathe, his voice a ragged shadow of its usual command. She didn't lower the microphone. She didn't give him the privacy of a husband. She looked at him, then drifted her eyes to Selena, a brief, dismissive glance that stripped the mistress of her perceived power in a single second. "Director Kong," Rachel said, using his formal title as if he were a stranger. "I'm so glad you could make it. I trust you found the evening's arrangements to be illuminating." The caught husband could only stare. The sharp jawline that usually projected strength was now tight with a frantic pulse. He looked at the massive screen behind her, where her image was projected under the words "Guest of Honor," and realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. He had brought a companion to humiliate a wife he thought was beneath him, only to find that he was the only one in the room who had been living in the dark. The walk across the ballroom hadn't been a path to a confrontation. It had been a walk to the gallows of his own ego. As Rachel turned back to the crowd to continue her speech, leaving him standing in the darkness of the foreground, Junh realized for the first time that the gilded cage hadn't been for her. It had been for him. And she had just unlocked the door and walked away, leaving him alone with a mistress who suddenly felt like an unbearable weight. The golden spotlight was a harsh, unforgiving judge, and under its glare, Selena W. Raines felt her carefully constructed world begin to fray at the seams. For months, she had been the secret center of Kang Junhae's universe, the vibrant fire that made his gray domestic life bearable. But as Rachel's voice continued to command the room with the effortless grace of a true sovereign, Selena realized with a jolt of terror that she had been invited to this gala not as a debutante, but as a prop in a play she didn't understand. The silence of the crowd was the worst part. They weren't looking at her with envy anymore. They were looking at her with the clinical pity reserved for a mistake. "Junh, we should go. This is a setup," Selena hissed, her voice cracking through the polished veneer of her socialite persona. She clutched his arm harder, her fingers trembling against his tuxedo. "She's doing this to humiliate you. We don't have to stay here and be mocked by her." But Junh didn't move. He stood like a man carved from salt, his eyes fixed on the woman on stage who had somehow replaced his wife. He was looking at Rachel as if he were seeing her for the very first time, and the hunger in his expression wasn't for Selena, it was for the power Rachel was currently radiating. Feeling the coldness of his neglect, a desperate, sharp venom rose in Selena's throat. She had sacrificed her reputation to be the woman on the arm of the Titan of Soul, and she refused to be eclipsed by a ghost. If she couldn't have the spotlight through prestige, she would take it through chaos. "Is this the hidden foundation you were talking about, Rachel?" Selena's voice rang out shrill and desperate, cutting through the sophisticated hum of the ballroom. She stepped forward, pulling away from Junhae's side, the crimson of her dress fluttering like a wounded bird. "A wife who hides in the shadows while her husband seeks comfort elsewhere? You can wear all the gold in Korea, but everyone here knows why he brought me tonight." A collective gasp rippled through the gala. The red dress's sting was out in the open, a jagged glass shard thrown into a room of silk. Selena stood tall, her chin trembling, waiting for the outburst, the tears, or the security guards. Anything that would center the drama back on her. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't even stop smiling. She simply lowered the microphone slightly and looked at Selena with the same detached curiosity one might afford a flickering light bulb. "Comfort, Selena?" Rachel asked, her voice unamplified but somehow carrying further than Selena's scream. "Is that what you call it? I always thought of you as an operational expense. A distraction I allowed so I could finish my work in peace." Rachel turned her gaze back to the room, dismissing the mistress as if she were a footnote in a much larger ledger. "You see, Selena, red is the color of those who want to be noticed. Gold is the color of those who are already valued. You've spent the evening trying to catch his eye, while I've spent the year buying his debt." The hum of the room returned, but this time it was a low, mocking chuckle. Selena felt the sting of the words more than any slap. She looked to Junh for defense, for a hand on her shoulder, but he was already looking away, his face tight with the realization that his distraction had just cost him his seat at the high table. Selena stood alone in the center of the ballroom, the flashy red gown now looking like a target. She had tried to reclaim the spotlight, but she had only succeeded in proving that in a room full of architects, she was merely the decoration, and the renovation had just begun. The golden luster of the Gala ballroom faded into the muted, clinical glow of a high-end home office 3 years prior. In this memory, the air didn't smell of champagne and expensive perfume. It smelled of cooling hardware and the rain-slicked pavement of the estate's gardens. While Junhale had been in Macau, expanding his territory with the loud, bloody theater of a traditional mobster, Rachel C. Hayes had been sitting in the dark, her face illuminated by the scrolling green code of 3 different monitors. To Junhale, Rachel was a sanctuary, a beautiful soft place to return to when his hands were too stained with the city's grime. He viewed her silence as peace, never realizing it was actually the quiet of a master strategist at work. Every time he bragged about a new shipping route or a successful bribe, Rachel would listen with a gentle smile, then wait for him to fall into a deep, bourbon-induced sleep. Only then would she take his biometric thumbprint to unlock the encrypted tablets he left on the nightstand. She didn't steal from him, she perfected him. Rachel had seen the leaks in his empire long before his most trusted lieutenants did. She saw the skimming in the Busan ports and the vulnerabilities in their digital money laundering cycles. Using her background in international finance and a dormant talent for systems architecture, she began to build a secondary, invisible infrastructure. She created shell companies that didn't just hide the syndicate's money, but multiplied it through high-frequency trading and tech investments that Junhale couldn't even pronounce. The silent architect worked in the margins of his life. While he was away at business dinners, that she knew were trysts with women like Selena, Rachel was securing the very ground he walked on. She bypassed his security protocols not to escape, but to understand them. She learned the rhythms of his guards, the back doors of his firewalls, and the names of the politicians who were actually plotting his downfall. She had saved his life a dozen times through anonymous tips and redirected funds before he even knew he was in danger. There were nights when she would look at him as he slept, a man who thought he was a king because he could shout the loudest and hit the hardest. She felt a profound, bittersweet irony. He called her his anchor, believing she kept him grounded in his humanity. He never suspected she was actually the engine, the one keeping his entire world from sinking into the dark sea of his own incompetence. Every diamond he bought her to assuage his guilt was catalogued and sold, the proceeds funneled into a private fund that now outvalued the syndicate's liquid assets. She had become the ghost in his machine, the silent partner who held the keys to every door he thought he had locked. As the flashback dissolved back into the reality of the gala, the power in Rachel's eyes made perfect sense. She wasn't just a guest of honor because of a sudden stroke of luck. She was the guest of honor because she had spent years building the stage she was now standing on. And Junhale was finally realizing that the woman he had tried to replace was the only reason he still had a name worth replacing at all. The transition from the gilded ballroom to the soundproofed sanctuary of the gala's private boardroom was like stepping from a fever dream into a block of ice. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, severing the distant music and the muffled roar of scandal. Inside, the air was still, smelling of leather and old power. Rachel didn't go to the side of the table where the spouses usually sat during high-level negotiations. She walked directly to the head of the long mahogany table, her gold gown shimmering under the recessed lighting like a warning. She didn't wait for Junhale to pull out her chair. She sat down with a deliberate, practiced ease that suggested she had already owned this room for years. Junhale stood by the door, his tuxedo jacket feeling suddenly too tight, his breath hitching in his chest. Behind him, the ghost of Selena's perfume still lingered on his sleeve, a reminder of the foolish, hollow man he had been only an hour ago. He looked at Rachel, and the titan of soul found he couldn't find the right tone for his voice. "Rachel, we need to handle this quietly," he began, his voice raspy, trying to reclaim some shred of his former authority. "The board, the family. They saw you on that stage. They think. They don't think, Junhale. They know," Rachel interrupted, her voice a cool, rhythmic strike. She slid a thin, encrypted tablet across the polished wood. It didn't contain photos of his infidelity. It contained the real-time balance sheets of his primary shipping lanes and the digital signatures of his most secret offshore accounts. Junhale stared at the screen, his face paling as he realized the depth of the abyss. Every bypass she had used to build her own wealth was a bypass he hadn't even known existed in his own system. You've been playing the part of the king so loudly that you didn't notice the kingdom was being sold from beneath your feet, she said, her almond-shaped eyes fixed on his with a preternatural stillness. You brought that girl to the gala to prove you were untouchable. But while you were showing her off, I was finishing the acquisition of the Varilai debt. You don't own the shipping routes anymore, Junhale. I do. He stepped toward the table, his hands trembling. You're my wife. You wouldn't destroy the family name. I'm the only reason the family name still has a cent of credit attached to it, she countered. She leaned forward, the gold sequins of her dress catching the light like a serpent's scales. Here are my terms. You will keep your title. You will remain the face of the syndicate, the man who handles the bloody theater that you love so much. The world will still fear you, but you will never again touch a passcode, a ledger, or a bribe without my direct authorization. Junhale felt a surge of his old ego, a spark of the man who ruled through fear. You're asking me to be a puppet. I'm asking you to be an enforcer, Rachel corrected, her voice dropping to a dangerous soft velvet. I hold the keys to the vault. I hold the evidence that could put you in a cell for 3 lifetimes. You get to keep your pride in public, but in this room you are the shadow. I am the architect. The silence that followed was suffocating. Junhale looked at the woman he had tried to replace, realizing that his mistress was a distraction, but his wife was a reckoning. He saw the cold, brilliant light in her eyes and understood that the cage doors hadn't just opened, they had been moved. He was no longer the master of the house. He was a guest in her empire. Slowly, his head bowed, not in defeat, but in a terrifying new kind of respect. He reached out and touched the edge of the tablet, a silent acknowledgement of the new world order. The vault stays with you, he whispered. Everything stays with me, Rachel replied, standing up and smoothing her gown. Now fix your tie. We have a gala to finish, and the guest of honor has a speech to conclude. Outside the boardroom, the gala had devolved into a hive of frantic whispers, and at the center of the swarm, Selena W. Rains felt the walls of her high society fantasy crumbling. She stood in the shadow of a marble pillar, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. The humiliation Rachel had inflicted on her wasn't just a social sting. It was an erasure. In the eyes of the elite, Selena had been downgraded from a Titan's favorite to a discarded curiosity, and the man she had relied on for protection was currently being dismantled behind closed doors. Desperation is a corrosive thing, and for Selena it manifested as a sharp, suicidal bravado. If she couldn't be the queen of Junhale's world, she would burn the palace down with Rachel inside it. She knew enough, had overheard enough during late nights at the estate, to know that the guest of honor was currently the only thing standing between the Varilai syndicate and total ruin. But she also knew that Rachel was the primary target for the Quan syndicate, the rival faction that had been hunting for a weakness in Junhale's armor for months. With trembling fingers, Selena pulled a sleek gold case phone from her clutch. She didn't call a friend or a publicist. She dialed a number she had memorized from a burner phone Junhale had thought was hidden in his study. I have something you want, Selena whispered, her voice a frantic hiss as she watched the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. The woman, Rachel Hayes. She's at the Diamond Gala, but she won't be in the ballroom for long. She's vulnerable. She's making a move for the south exit in 20 minutes. The voice on the other end was like grinding gravel, cold and devoid of mercy. Selena felt a shiver of pure, cold dread, but she pushed through it. She told herself this was survival. If Rachel was removed from the equation, captured, neutralized, or worse, Junhale would have nowhere else to turn. He would be broken, and she would be the one to pick up the pieces of his shattered ego. She would be his sanctuary again, not because he loved her, but because she would be the only one left. Give me your word, Selena added, her eyes darting to a passing waiter. Junhale isn't to be touched. Only her. The line went dead without a promise. Selena tucked the phone away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She smoothed the silk of her red gown, trying to compose her face into a mask of indifferent beauty. She walked back toward the main hall, her heels clicking a rhythmic, treacherous beat on the polished floor. She told herself the red dress's sting wasn't over. It was merely shifting from a social barb to a lethal strike. As she re-entered the ballroom, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors. She looked radiant, flashy, and desperate. She didn't notice the way the security guards in the periphery were shifting their positions, or the way the silent architect had already accounted for the possibility of a serpent's bite. Selena believed she had just regained the upper hand, unaware that in the world of the Varili, a leak wasn't a mistake, it was an invitation for a massacre. She stood near the champagne fountain, waiting for the chaos she had unleashed, oblivious to the fact that when you invite a predator to a feast, you often end up as the main course. The transition from the public spectacle of the gala to the familiar stone walls of the Varili estate was supposed to offer Junh a sense of returning to his fortress. Instead, it felt like entering a meticulously crafted trap. As the armored SUV pulled into the sweeping driveway, the heavy iron gates hissed shut with a finality that made his skin crawl. Usually, the guards at the perimeter would snap to attention, their eyes fixed forward in a display of rigid, terrified loyalty to him. Tonight, however, their eyes moved past him, tracking the silhouette of Rachel in the back seat with a deference that was far more chilling. Inside the grand foyer, the atmosphere of a house divided was palpable. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, ozone smell of the high-end security hub. Junh stepped into the center of the hall, his hand instinctively reaching for the encrypted radio at his hip to signal a full estate lockdown. "Section 4 is unsecured," he barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I want eyes on the perimeter and the mistress's guest suite barred until further notice." The guards didn't move. They stood like statues of carbon and steel, their faces unreadable. From the top of the sweeping marble staircase, the head of his security detail, a man who had bled for Junh in the gutters of Busan, looked down with a regretful, steady gaze. "The perimeter is already secured, Director," the man said softly. "But the protocols have been updated. We are operating under the guest of honor's encryption now." Junh felt a stream of ice water go down his spine. He turned to Rachel, who was calmly handing her silk clutch to a maid. She didn't look like a woman who had just survived a public betrayal. She looked like a general returning from a successful campaign. "What is this, Rachel?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibrato. "You've turned my own men against me in my own house?" "I didn't turn them, Junh. I bought them out of their precariousness," she replied, her voice smooth and melodic. She walked toward the security monitors embedded in the wall, her fingers dancing over the touchscreens with a familiarity that made his jaw tighten. "While you were paying them in fear and the occasional bonus, I was setting up trust funds for their children and ensuring their families had medical coverage that your syndicate doesn't provide. They aren't yours anymore because they realized I am the one who keeps the lights on." It was a cold war fought in the margins of his life. Junh looked around his foyer and realized he was a stranger in his own kingdom. The very men he had trained to be his blades were now the walls of Rachel's fortress. He saw the shift in their posture, the way they formed a protective, impenetrable circle around her, leaving him standing in the center of the room, isolated and exposed. "You're making a mistake," he whispered, the titan of soul, suddenly sounding very small in the vastness of the hall. "A house divided cannot stand against the Quan." "This house isn't divided, Junh," Rachel said, turning to look at him, her almond-shaped eyes reflecting the scrolling data of the security feeds. "It's being renovated. You just haven't decided if you're part of the new foundation, or the debris we're clearing away." The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the servers. Junh realized that the gilded cage had truly inverted. He wasn't the master of the estate. He was the most prestigious prisoner in it. He watched as Rachel walked toward the private study, the guards falling into step behind her like a royal guard, leaving him alone in the dark foyer with nothing but the scent of his own fading power. The private study was a room Junh had always considered his inner sanctum, a place where his word was law and his secrets were buried in heavy steel safes. But as he followed Rachel inside, he found the room transformed. The monitors that usually displayed stock tickers and port traffic were now flooded with a different kind of data. Private messages, offshore bank transfers, and grainy surveillance footage from warehouses he hadn't visited in months. Rachel sat at his desk, not as a guest but as the rightful owner of the chair. She didn't look at him. Her focus was on a digital ledger glowing on the central screen. You think I've been undermining you, Junhale, she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. You think tonight was about a wife's revenge. But while you were indulging in Selena's cheap validation, I was the only thing preventing your inner circle from putting a bullet in your back. She tapped a key, and a series of highlighted transactions appeared. Junhale leaned over the desk, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the signatures. It was Park and Choi, his two most trusted lieutenants, men he had elevated from the streets, men who shared his blood in a dozen skirmishes. They've been skimming 40% of the Busan intake, Rachel explained, her tone as clinical as a coroner's report. They were using the funds to build a private militia within your own ranks. They weren't just stealing your money. They were preparing to replace you. They saw your distraction with Selena as the perfect window. They thought a man who couldn't see his wife standing in the room would never notice a knife at his throat. Junhale felt a different kind of coldness take root in his chest, a hollow vibrating anger that made his hands shake. I would have seen it. I have eyes everywhere. You had eyes on the mirror admiring yourself, Rachel countered, finally looking up. Her gaze was steady, devoid of the heat he expected. I've been intercepting their communications for 18 months. Every time Park tried to divert a shipment, I redirected it. Every time Choi tried to contact the Kwan Syndicate to negotiate your head, I made sure the line was dead. I didn't do it to save your ego. I did it because I built this empire's financial heart, and I wasn't going to let two-bit thugs tear it down because the king was too busy playing house with a socialite. She scrolled further down, revealing a ledger of lies that detailed every betrayal Junhale had missed. It wasn't just money, it was a map of his own obsolescence. He saw the dates, the times, the locations. He saw how many times his life had been a coin toss that Rachel had quietly rigged in his favor. You've been protecting me, he whispered, the realization bruising his pride more than any physical blow. I've been protecting the Foundation, she corrected. But the protection ends tonight. Park and Choi know the encryption has changed. They know the guest of honor is no longer a ghost. They're desperate now, and a desperate man is a loud one. Junhale looked at the screen, then at his wife. The black and gold ink on his arms suddenly felt heavy, like a history of errors he could no longer ignore. He realized then that his gilded cage for her was actually a sanctuary for him, a place where she had kept the wolves at bay while he preened for the cameras. What's the move? He asked, his voice low and stripped of its former bluster. For the first time he wasn't giving an order. He was asking for a directive. Rachel didn't hesitate. She closed the ledger and met his eyes. The move is to let them think they're still in control. We return to the gala after-party. We give them a target. And then Junhale, you will finally do what you're best at. You will be the blade. But this time, I'm the one swinging it. The return to the Diamond Gala for the exclusive after-party felt less like a celebration and more like a walk into a firing squad. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a more intimate, dimly lit lounge where the scent of expensive cigars and whispered conspiracies hung heavy in the air. As the heavy doors opened, the ambient noise dropped by half. Every eye in the room, most notably those of Park and Choi, who stood near the bar like vultures, tracked the entrance of the power couple. Junhale walked with a stiff, calculated elegance. He no longer felt like a conqueror, but for the first time in years he felt like a predator with a purpose. Beside him, Rachel was a vision of lethal sophistication. She had replaced the microphone with a flute of untasted champagne, her gold gown shimmering like a coat of mail under the low-slung chandeliers. In the center of the room, Selena stood waiting. She had refreshed her makeup, but the desperation in her eyes was a stain no powder could hide. She saw Junhale and took a step forward, her red dress a frantic signal of her supposed claim. She assumed the private husband and wife talk had resulted in a domestic truce, one where she would remain the necessary outlet for Junhale's frustrations. Junhale, she said, her voice pitched just high enough to be heard by the surrounding tables. She reached out, her hand trembling as she aimed for his arm. You were gone so long. I thought perhaps the guest of honor had overstayed her welcome. The room held its breath. This was the moment of public choice, the pivot point where the Varilai Empire's internal rot would either be exposed or cauterized. Junhale didn't flinch. He didn't look at the hand reaching for him. Instead, he stopped and turned slightly toward Rachel, his movement fluid and deliberate. He reached out and placed his hand firmly on the small of Rachel's back, a gesture of public alignment that was as unmistakable as a declaration of war. "The guest of honor is exactly where she belongs, Selena," Junh said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried to the furthest corners of the lounge. He looked at the mistress with a cold, clinical detachment that made her hand drop to her side as if burned. "And you are currently standing in the space reserved for my business associates. I suggest you find your own table. Or better yet, your own exit." The red dress's sting had finally turned inward. Selena's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing in a silent fish-like shock. She looked to the room for support, but the vultures had already turned away. Park and Choi were staring at their glasses, their faces tight with the realization that their distracted king was no longer looking at the woman in red. He was looking through her directly at them. "Rachel and I have much to discuss with our partners tonight," Junh continued, his gaze drifting over to his lieutenants, pinning them to their seats. "Those who are interested in the future of the Varilai Foundation should stay. Those who prefer the shadows, well, the shadows are about to become very crowded." Rachel leaned in closer to Junh, the gold of her dress brushing against the black of his tuxedo. She didn't need to speak. The radiating power and calm she projected was enough to finish the execution. She offered Selena a single dismissive nod, the kind one gives to a servant whose contract has just been terminated. As Selena stumbled back into the crowd, her flashy red gown finally looking like the costume of a ghost, Junh felt a strange, terrifying rush of heat in his chest. It wasn't the hollow lust of the past, but a profound, grounding respect for the woman at his side. He had publicly chosen his queen, and in doing so, he had signaled to the wolves that the hunt had officially changed directions. The transition from the calculated tension of the lounge to the visceral chaos of war happened in the span of a heartbeat. One moment the air was filled with the rhythmic clinking of crystal and the low hum of high-stakes gossip. The next, the massive stained glass skylight of the hotel atrium shattered inward. A rain of jagged diamond-like shards cascaded onto the dance floor, followed by the concussive roar of a flashbang that turned the world into a blinding high-pitched scream. The crimson ambush had begun. From the shattered ceiling and the service entrances, gunmen from the Quan Syndicate flooded the room, their movements a practiced, lethal choreography. They didn't aim for the crowd. They aimed for the gold. They aimed for Rachel. Junh's instincts, honed in the gutters and back alleys of his rise to power, took over before the smoke could even settle. He didn't reach for a microphone or a bottle of champagne. He reached for Rachel. With a sudden violent grace, he lunged forward, his arm hooking around her waist and pulling her behind the heavy mahogany bar just as a rhythmic stutter of gunfire tore through the upholstery of the chairs they had occupied seconds before. "Stay down!" he roared over the cacophony of shattering glass and panicked screams. The luxury hotel was no longer a palace of excess. It was a kill zone. To his left, he saw the chaos of the house divided manifest. Park and Choi, caught between their own treachery and the immediate threat of death, scrambled for cover, their faces pale with the realization that their secret negotiations with the Quan hadn't bought them a seat at the table. It had bought them a front-row seat to an execution. Beside him, Rachel was a contrast of terrifying stillness. While the socialites around them dissolved into hysterics, she remained crouched in the shadow of the bar, her eyes scanning the room with the same radiating power and calm she had possessed on stage. She wasn't looking for an exit. She was looking for an opening. "The service lift behind the kitchen," she hissed into his ear, her voice steady despite the bullets chewing through the wood above their heads. "It's on an independent power grid. I locked it down 10 minutes ago. I can override it from my phone." Junh looked at her, the black and gold ink on his arms flexed and ready for slaughter. He realized then that she hadn't just predicted the betrayal. She had mapped the battlefield. "I'll draw the fire," Junh said, his voice a low, guttural promise. "You move when I break the line." He didn't wait for her consent. He vaulted over the bar with a roar, his suppressed pistol barking 3 times in rapid succession, dropping 2 Quan gunmen who were advancing through the smoke. He was a whirlwind of dark silk and lethal intent, a titan reclaiming his throne through fire and blood. He moved with a reckless desperation, intentionally making himself the most visible target in the room to pull every barrel away from the woman in gold. Tracer rounds cut through the air, painting the room in streaks of crimson light. Junh felt the hot sting of a graze on his shoulder, but he didn't slow down. He saw Rachel move. A streak of shimmering gold darting toward the kitchen entrance, protected by a handful of loyal guards who had finally found their purpose. As the hotel ballroom dissolved into a graveyard of broken crystal and spent shells, Junh felt a strange soaring clarity. He was no longer fighting for a shipping route or a ledger. He was fighting for the architect of his future. The Crimson Ambush was meant to be the end of the Varilai Empire, but as Junh stood his ground against a sea of enemies, he realized it was merely the forge where his new life was being tempered. The air tasted of ozone and burnt rubber, a sharp metallic tang that signaled the end of the line. Behind them, the ruins of the sector were being swallowed by a relentless tide of shadows, but in front of them, miraculously, was the extraction vehicle. The armored car sat idling, its heavy plating scarred but intact, a lone beacon of safety in a world that had turned into a slaughterhouse. Go! Junh's voice was a rough rasp, barely audible over the screech of the approaching swarm. He shoved Rachel forward, his massive hand steady against the small of her back. Don't look back, Rachel. Just run. Rachel didn't need the command to feel the urgency, but the sheer weight of the terror nipping at her heels made her legs feel like lead. She stumbled, her boots skidding on the slick, oil-stained pavement. Every breath felt like inhaling glass. She could hear them now, the skittering of claws, the guttural, inhuman clicks of the pursuers closing the gap. She reached the heavy iron door of the transport, her fingers scrabbling against the cold handle. Junh, come on! She screamed, swinging the door open. The interior of the car was dim, smelling of stale grease and safety, but as she turned to pull him in, the world seemed to slow into a horrifying rhythmic strobe. A shadow, faster than the rest, detached itself from the gloom of a collapsed storefront. It was a blur of obsidian limbs and jagged edges. Junh saw it before she did. He didn't hesitate. Instead of diving for the open door, he pivoted, planting his feet to form a human wall between Rachel and the nightmare. The impact was sickening. A wet, heavy thud followed by the sound of tearing fabric and grinding bone. Junh let out a choked grunt, his body jerking violently as the creature's serrated blade limb drove through the meat of his shoulder. He didn't fall. With a roar that sounded more like a tectonic plate shifting than a human cry, he grabbed the creature's neck with one hand and slammed it into the pavement with enough force to crack the concrete. Junh! Rachel lunged back toward the opening, her hand outstretched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Stay in the car, he bellowed. Blood, dark and thick, was already soaking through his tactical vest, blooming like a gruesome flower across his chest. He staggered, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches, but he stayed upright. He used his good arm to swing the heavy door shut, the latch clicking into place with a finality that felt like a death knell. Through the reinforced glass of the small viewport, Rachel watched in agonizing silence. Junh leaned his forehead against the metal of the door for a single fleeting second, leaving a smear of red behind. He looked exhausted, not just from the wound, but from the weight of everything they had endured. Then he pushed off. He turned his back to the vehicle, drawing his secondary blade with a hand that trembled only slightly. He stood alone in the center of the road, a wounded titan blocking the path, as the first wave of the swarm broke against the light of the headlights. The engine roared to life, the automated system sensing the proximity of the threat and the closure of the seals. As the armored car began to lurch forward, Rachel pressed her palms against the glass, her vision blurring. Junh didn't look back. He simply stepped into the fray, a silhouette of defiance against an impossible darkness, ensuring that the only thing following Rachel was the sound of the wind. The velvet curtains of the inner sanctum had always felt like a cocoon, but tonight they felt like a shroud. Selena stood in the center of the gilded chamber, her reflection caught in a dozen antique mirrors, each one mocking the precise symmetry of her face. For years her beauty had been a master key, unlocking reinforced doors and loosening the tongues of the sector's most powerful men. She had navigated the apocalypse with the grace of a predator, convinced that as long as she remained the most exquisite thing in a dying world, she was untouchable. The door behind her groaned on its hinges, and the heavy rhythmic tread of boots shattered the silence. It wasn't the soft, worshipful approach she was used to. This was the sound of a janitor coming to clear away a spill. "The council has reached a decision, Selena," a voice rasped. It belonged to Kalen, a man who had once spent a month's rations just to sit at her table. Now he didn't even look her in the eye. He was focused on a clipboard, his thumb tracing a line of dwindling inventory. A decision? Selena turned, her silk robe trailing like a dying flame. She allowed a practiced, vulnerable tremor to enter her lower lip, the look that usually brought men to their knees. "Surely they understand the value of my connections. The information I bring. The information is stale and the connections are dead or hiding," Kalen interrupted, his voice flat. He finally looked up, and for the first time, Selena saw the terrifying absence of desire in his gaze. He looked at her the way one looks at a luxury watch when the battery has died and the glass is cracked. "We're moving to the subterranean levels. Resources are tight. Oxygen scrubbers can only support those who contribute to the labor pool or the defense perimeter." Selena felt a cold prickle of dread crawl up her spine. "I contribute. I maintain morale. You consume," Kalen said, stepping aside to reveal two guards waiting in the hall. They weren't there to escort her to dinner. They were carrying her small trunk, already packed and latched. "Beauty is a luxury of the sunlit world, Selena. Down there in the dark it doesn't filter air or patch a hull. You've devalued." The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. In the old world her face was a fortune. In the transition it was a weapon. But here, at the edge of extinction, it was merely an expensive weight. The currency she had spent her life hoarding had suddenly been removed from circulation. She didn't scream as the guards took her elbows. She was too proud for that even now. She walked between them, her head held high, through the corridors that had once been her kingdom. She passed the dining hall where she had once been the center of every conversation, and she saw the way the others looked away. It wasn't out of spite. It was indifference. She was no longer a person to them, she was a surplus. They reached the heavy airlock that led to the outer slums, the gray, ash-choked buffer zone between the fortress and the waste. The hydraulic hiss of the door opening felt like a final breath. "Good luck," Kalen said, and there was a flicker of something like pity in his eyes, which was far worse than hatred. The guards nudged her forward, and the door slammed shut with a metallic finality that vibrated through the soles of her thin slippers. Selena stood alone in the dim, soot-stained light of the alleyway. The wind whined through the rusted scaffolding, carrying the scent of rain and rot. She reached up, touching the perfect line of her jaw, the skin still soft and smelling of expensive oils. It was still there, the face that had launched 1,000 schemes. But as a group of scavengers emerged from the shadows, their eyes hungry and their hands gripped tight on iron pipes, Selena realized that for the first time in her life, she was invisible. Or worse, she was just meat. The glass walls of the central office offered a panoramic view of a city struggling to breathe. But inside, the air was still and smelled of ozone and expensive parchment. Rachel sat behind the heavy obsidian desk, her fingers tracing the jagged grain of the wood. It was a seat built for someone twice her size. A throne of industry and blood that had once belonged to men who viewed her as a decorative bird in a gilded cage. Now the cage was gone, and the bird had inherited the ruins. The heavy pneumatic doors hissed open, and the rhythmic, weighted thud of boots announced his arrival before he even crossed the threshold. Junh stepped into the light, his massive frame silhouetted against the flickering neon of the sector below. His arm was still bound in a high-tensile medical sling, and a fresh, jagged scar traced the line of his jaw, a permanent receipt for the price he'd paid at the armored car. He didn't bow. He didn't have to. The way he positioned himself at her right hand, eyes scanning the shadows of the room with predatory intent, said more than any gesture of fealty ever could. "The captains from the lower docks are waiting," Junh said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. "They're restless. They remember you as the girl in the silk dresses. They don't think you have the stomach for the ledger." Rachel looked up, her gaze cool and unblinking. She wasn't wearing silk tonight. She wore tactical black, the fabric stiff and functional, and her hair was pulled back so tightly it sharpened the predatory angles of her face. "Let them wait," she replied, her voice steady. "Let them wonder if I'm as cruel as the men who came before me. or if I'm something entirely new. Uncertainty is a more effective leash than fear. She leaned forward, spreading a map of the remaining supply lines across the desk. The syndicate had been shattered by the recent incursions, its hierarchy gutted, leaving a vacuum that sucked in the desperate and the greedy. She began to mark the junctions with a steady hand, redrawing the boundaries of an empire that would no longer rely on the whims of the council or the beauty of its pawns. We aren't just rebuilding a black market, Junh, she whispered, more to herself than to him. We're building a spine. This city is collapsing because it has no center. I am going to be that center. Junh placed his good hand on the corner of the desk, his knuckles scarred and bruised. He looked at her not as a protector looks at a ward, but as a general looks at a sovereign. They'll come for you. The ones who think the throne is vacant because a woman sits in it. Let them come, Rachel said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, a cold, sharp thing that didn't reach her eyes. I've spent my whole life learning how to survive in the dark. They're just now realizing the sun has gone down. She stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below, the flickering lights of the sector looked like embers in a dying fire. For years she had looked out of windows like this and seen a world she was forbidden to touch. Now she looked out and saw a map. She saw the weak points, the leverage, and the potential. The transition from captive to queen hadn't been a leap. It had been a shedding of skin. Every indignity, every moment of being underestimated, had been a lesson in the architecture of power. She turned back to Junh, the light of the city casting long, distorted shadows across the office. Bring them in, she commanded. As the doors cycled open to admit the men who thought they could rule the ruins, Junh stepped back into the periphery, a silent, wounded titan guarding the new order. Rachel didn't sit back down. She stood tall, framed by the chaos of a world in flames, ready to show them that while beauty might be a devalued currency, iron and will were still worth everything.